Bob Mills is one of, if not the original Disneyland puppeteers, performing marionette shows at the park starting in 1957. Before that, he puppeteered at Children's Fairyland in Oakland, California, and before that, he was the resident puppeteer and clown for the TV show Just Kids, which broadcast every weekday in Hawaii. Bob would later step away from puppetry to do makeup for some of the biggest stars in film and television. I talked to Bob Mills about all of this and more on this episode of Under the Puppet. You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show. Welcome to the show that is preserving puppetry through the personal stories of professional puppeteers. My name is Grant Pachoco, and this is Under the Puppet. Bob Mills, welcome to Under the Puppet. It's great to have you here, and I would love to start by asking you, when did you discover puppets?
Well, I discovered puppets because of Bob Baker. My mom took me down to the department store Christmas time to see if there was something I wanted, and I saw some people working puppets in the window. And then I went upstairs, and there was a lady demonstrating these marionettes, which Bob Baker marketed. And, I love that. I want one of those, So for Christmas, I got, he made them in pairs. The clowns weren't, I don't think, in pairs as much, but all the other things were, a Dutch boy and a Dutch girl. That's what I had, was the Dutch boy and the Dutch girl. And so originally, she got me the Dutch boy. And, I loved that. And I used to go walking that around. And my grandmother would have a card party, and I had this puppet walking around. So for my birthday in October, my mom bought me the girl. So I had the pair. Now I learned to work with both of them, And so that was how I started in puppets. Had never before that had anything to do with puppets. My dad was in the Navy, and the war was on. So we seldom saw my dad. If he had a short leave, he'd come to Los Angeles to see us and then have to go back to his ship. And he was in submarines mostly. When the war was over, he wanted us to join him in Philadelphia because his submarine was at Philadelphia Naval Shipyard being serviced. And so we did. My mom packed everything up, had everything we had put into storage. And we went to Philly, lived there for a year, went to school. And then my dad, the submarines were changed over to Panama. So then we had to go to Panama. No puppets. And my two puppets of Baker's were in some packed up thing in L.A. So anyway, we were there 1 year in Panama, which I loved, by the way. I was in the Boy Scouts. We used to go camping out in the jungle and all kinds of stuff, And then we were transferred they changed the sub base to go to Key West, Florida. So then when we got in Key West, my mom decided, knew we were going to be there longer, a few years. So she wanted to get what we had in Los Angeles in storage, and the Navy would ship it. And so there were my puppets. And there was a professional puppet show that came to my high school, it was at junior high then. Alice in Wonderland was the store, and I didn't know who it was, but years later, it seemed like it was a company of Sue Hastings puppets, because by this time she wasn't working, running shows, but she was teaching at some university around Miami. And she used to send some graduate students out with a set of puppets to get the experience of actually doing a show. So I kind of figured that's who that must have been. They spoke live over microphones. So I got picked through a kid in the art department to help backstage, and which I was delighted to. And they said, now when we nod our head up and down, you pull the curtain and open the curtain or close the curtain. So you just watch us, And they were talking because they were both speaking live over the microphones, and there was no recording. So anyway, I was looking, and they did the scene where they had the Mad Tea Party, and March Hare and the Mad Hatter were saying to the Dormouse, we're going to put him in the teapot, in the teapot. They kept saying, in the teapot, and I was looking to see, could they really put that puppet in a teapot? And I forgot all about the puppeteers up there. And some lady came and tapped me on the shoulder and says, I think they want something. And they were going like, in the teapot, in the teapot. So, pull the curtain. And so this was my first experience around a professional company. I saw some of the things at Bob Baker's, but they were like birthday. He did a lot of birthday party things. And so at that time, expensive ones, but I didn't see any of his other things. So anyway, the next puppet company that came the next year was the Comes Home Marionettes from New York, and that was Cedric Head was the man, had been in business a long time, and they were doing an operetta, HMS Pinafore, and I got to know them really well, he and the lady that worked with him, and that was the only other time. And then we got transferred up to Michigan, and a little town called Cadillac. My dad was stationed at a Naval Reserve training center, so no puppets up there. There was hardly anything up there, as a matter of fact. A lot of snow. And so that was my chance to really, my bedroom got turned into my workshop. And I had a great a set of articles out of Popular Mechanics that Rufus Rose did. If you ever saw that, it tells you everything about how to sculpt, cast, plaster cast. And then there was another one that followed it, the Stevens did. So I had these two. These were my Bibles, looking, how do you do that? How do you make joints and things? But other than going to high school, there was nothing. The town just didn't have anything.
Yeah.
My dad often wondered what the Naval Reserve Training Center was doing there. But anyway, so then when we were transferred to Hawaii. Oh, that was good, to go to Hawaii. So we were there for 3 years, and that's when I really got involved in puppetry professionally, if you want to call it that. A friend of mine that I had in high school, who I was going to the university by this time, University of Hawaii, and he was doing piano monologues. That was his thing, and he said, "I heard they're going to have an audition at this place in Waikiki." Because they're going to do a new big television show with mainland sponsors. Up at that point, if there were sponsors for anything, it was like the Yiklung preserved foods or Malasada's Portuguese things in Hawaii. Nothing from the mainland. This was going to be actually mainland big sponsors were going to do this. And he did a comedy thing on radio, apparently, always. Jayaku had Pupuli, which was a Hawaiian thing for crazy fish head or something. And the guy that was directing it, Chubby Roland Cloutier, was going to start his own show in a month on television too, and his show was called Just Kids. So he said, "Would you like to be on my show? I'd love to have puppets on the show." Of course, I said yes. So when we did the audition, and the unfortunate thing is my friend with the monologue didn't get picked, and I didn't even want to do it, and I got picked. So I actually appeared on television for the first time. And so then every week I was on Chubby's Just Kids show, and he also showed our gang comedy films and so forth, Then he said, "They never see you with the puppets." He said, "Think of something else you could do where they'd see you, and we could, have another person on, like another character, and I'd pay a little more money, but it wouldn't be like adding something to the payroll, really."
Right.
So I said, okay. And then, of course, being very creative, I said, "Well, I could be a clown." "Oh, that'd be good." He said he'd like that. And so I became Colo the Clown, which I have a picture of, by the way. And there I am as Colo the Clown.
Oh, I love it. I really love that style of those kid shows. Those they were. I mean, when I was a kid, they were kind of on their way out. We had one or two, but that has always been something that fascinates me. Is that you're performing? How many days a week was this show on?
Oh, it was 5 days a week.
5 days a week.
Yeah.
So you're just performing every single day.
Well, I didn't.
You didn't.
I
Okay.
would only be on once or twice a week with the puppets,
Okay.
and then once or twice a week as the clown. So probably I'd appear about 4 times when I finally got the clown going too.
Yeah.
And I didn't speak as the clown. I just pantomimed. And at first, the name that he thought was called Tinkle. Well, kept getting it mixed up. So finally we decided, no, the Tinkle doesn't work. So I became Cola Clown, Kola. And although I sort of always thought it was because one of the sponsors was RC Cola.
Got it.
But they were spelled differently. It was like the Hawaiian Cola, Kola, and not Cola,
Yeah.
Anyway.
When you were growing up, and you mentioned that your mom bought you the marionette, seeing it in the store, and you mentioned your dad was in the armed forces, and
Navy,
were they supportive of your passion of getting into
my
puppets?
mom was.
Yeah.
My dad, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
He said one time, "I wish you quit playing with those dolls." For him, they were dolls.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until years later when I was performing at Disneyland that he told me he was actually proud of me. And one time when I was in Key West, I started making them, and I had them sort of pinned on the wall, but they were simple marionettes. He came in and was mad at me for doing this, and he just tore them off the wall. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Stop playing with these damn dolls."
Well, were your parents creative at all when you were were your mom or dad creative in any way?
Well, my mom was a singer. She trained younger to be an opera singer. But the Depression was on. My grandparents didn't have hardly any money. And she actually worked as a housekeeper maid for this woman who was an opera singer who was not retired exactly, but she gave lessons. And so my mom did that to pay for her lessons with this Catherine Wentz. And Catherine Wentz's husband had a business of sheet music, and he rented to the studios and everything all the time. All this, he had everything, and all the parts and everything for the different instruments to play. And but Mom had nothing to do with that part of it, But eventually, I guess either she didn't want to do it anymore or something. She won a medal in singing against girls much older in California-wide medal. It was called Stedfoid things. But other than that, no, my dad was not, he didn't have anything creative. He liked cars. And that was his thing, is always having cars of all kinds. He and his buddies, when he was younger, were going to run around speeding in cars and stuff like that, And because of the Depression, things where he worked, got a job. The government had these thing called the young guys worked up in the forest helping clear the forest, CCC camps, and he did that, and to earn a living. He had always wanted to be in the Navy, and he couldn't get in because he had kind of flat feet, and they wouldn't take you if you had flat feet. So he used to roll his feet on Coke bottles trying to build up his arches. He finally got him up enough where he qualified, and he got in the Navy. But he and my mom had gotten married, and in the meantime, and they had me, and they wouldn't take you if you were married. You had to be single to go in the Navy. This is before the Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. And so they had to lie. My dad had to lie and say that he was not married and had no dependents to get in the Navy. And he got in the Navy. So we didn't really see much of him because he had to go to boot camp, which I think might have been in San Diego, but I'm not sure. And then later on, he was on ships, and submarines and all that stuff. And he'd just see little bits of him coming in and out of L.A. And, but no, there was my mom was very supportive of me with the puppets. And she liked, what I did, but not my dad.
Yeah.
He would have been much happier if I would like cars.
Right. Right. Well, the other question I wanted to ask is, you mentioned that you had these articles that were kind of showing you how to build the puppets.
For Rufus Rose did the one. I still have those articles, and Martin L. Olga Stevens did the other set.
And where were you getting your supplies and everything? Just like the hardware store, or to build the puppets? Yeah.
Well, plastic wood was readily available in the hardware store, and that's what you made the heads out of. You sculpted them out of clay, made a plaster mold of it, and then you soaked the mold in water, and then you put a little pancake of plastic wood inside, and soaked it in water till it kind of cured, and then you took it out, floated the mold off of the head, and then that's how you made the plastic heads and hands and everything. Rufus Rose seemed to make everything, legs and everything, cast up. Mm-hmm. But the Stevens, he carved most everything. And I have one of the Stevens puppets. I don't have any of the Rose puppets.
Did you enjoy that process of like sculpting heads and sculpting hands?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And did it take you long to develop, or did you take naturally to it when you first started?
I think I took naturally to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm not saying I didn't get better as the time went on,
right.
But and all of my puppets were aimed towards children. I loved clowns, and so I always was making clowns, and I would make some characters that I liked from a story, but I never made the whole story, and I never did it. But for instance, there was a story of the 3 billy goats Gruff. Mm-hmm. I made a billy goat because I liked that, but I never made the other characters. There was a Rapunzel thing with her. The witch had her let down her long hair so the prince could climb without a stair. Well, I made the Rapunzel with long yarn braids, but I didn't make the rest of them. That's right. How I did. I just wasn't interested in doing a play. And although I took in college, I had drama classes and play reading, but I just didn't have the interest in doing a play.
And when you were doing the Just Kids show in Hawaii, can you give us an example of when you were doing puppets on the show, what would your segment be? Would it be acting out a story? Would it be doing a song? What were your little segments?
The puppets would, of course, a recording would be singing, playing any music. I wanted to play the ukulele, and they danced and things like that, that kind of thing.
And were you coming up with new pieces every week
somewhat, somewhat. Mm-hmm. There was you could change the costumes sometimes or something, or have them do something different, but I didn't I didn't have time to make new ones for every show. It was, too time consuming.
Yeah. And did you work on Just Kids like through the end of that show, or did you leave that show, or?
No, we had to leave because my dad got transferred to Oakland, California.
Okay.
And so I had to leave. And I don't know how the guy who had the show, I don't know, Chubby, I don't know. But he always had these film clips, from our gang, and he did those always anyway. He did fun things with the kids, and I could do things too, as a clown. But couldn't speak. Mm-hmm. And one time he really jumped on me because I had this thing with a teacup on a saucer, and I would lift it up. I'd look like this, and the kids would, they wouldn't see. There was nothing under there, but they would look like and they'd all go, and they were laughing and everything. And Chubby was trying to do a commercial, and he jammed into me after that. Don't you ever do that when I'm doing a commercial. Those commercials pay for this show, I got so involved with the teacup and with the kids,
Yeah.
But so I worked out things to do that were funny, and but the clown, I think maybe I told you I made quite a lot of extra money from that people would call on it. Well, if Colo the Clown could come and make an appearance for their opening of their new store or their new, automobiles for the season, and Colo the Clown could be there, and they could advertise that. And I actually had to be in Shrine Circus called, and after if I could just come and walk around the arena, and we announced the Colo the Clown from Just Kids is here, stuff like that, mm-hmm. And they paid for it.
Yeah. How long were you with that show?
Must have been close to 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it must be, I don't know. I think when you're doing something like that, it's just a great education, even and you. When you get to do something over, and I know we'll get to Disneyland and to Fairyland and Disneyland, where you're doing things over and over again, but mm-hmm. You just really ramp up your skills if you can do the same thing, over.
I had to try to think of different things that I could do with the puppets and the clown, But mostly neither one was 5 days a week.
Right.
So I could do some puppets or be the clown or something, you know. And
Yeah,
I was
were you
going to
doing-
the university at the same time.
Oh, okay.
See,
And were you doing puppets anywhere outside of the television show? Like you mentioned, the clown would go around. Were you doing any like?
I don't
puppet
recall
shows?
that I did the
No.
puppets outside. No. Seemed to be what it was the clown people were interested in coming. Maybe they never thought the puppets could come there or something. I don't know what. But
Right.
And of course the clown was a full size person, you know.
Right.
And I remember there were a few rude remarks from sailors or something went by when I was the clown at the car thing. You know, they'd say, "Get F you, you know, clown."
Oh boy.
But
Well, you say your dad got stationed over in Oakland, and of course, Oakland is where Children's Fairyland is.
yeah.
So
Well, I didn't know anything about that.
okay, yeah. Let's talk about.
When we got there, because I was now involved in puppetry, I was in, and I belonged to the Puppeteers of America, which is a national organization, and I had a directory of all the members and their telephone numbers all over the country. And so when we got to Oakland, I thought, well, maybe I'll look in this directory, see if there's any puppets here in Oakland. Well, there were like about 3 or 4 listed, and I called them, but nobody answered. And so I guess they were at work or whatever the case was. And finally, this lady answered, and she said her name was Dorothy Hayward, and that she was the director of the puppet theater at Children's Fairyland. I didn't know what Children's Fairyland was. And she said, I have to put a new show in. She said, within about a month. Do you have a show? And I said, well, not really. I don't do plays or anything. And I told her why. I said, you know, and we discussed it. She said, well, what could you do with that? And I said, well, I could put a circus together with all the different puppets that I have. I had a wire walker and different things, you know. Okay, that's what we'll do. We'll do it that. And so, because she was desperate at that point, she had a contract with Fairyland that she and her husband did it before, but he died, and he was a magician also. And his puppets were pretty crude. They were obviously made from dolls. But anyway, you know, that's how they had that for a few years, and he was much, much older than her. And they had a child, and so anyway, that had nothing to do with that. But anyway, so I started at Fairyland, and I thought, this is beautiful. Look at this. Have you been there?
Yep. Yeah, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay
Well, you know
Area,
what it's
so,
like. You
yeah.
know, it's great. And so and I was doing the show for, I don't know for how long I'd been doing it. But she would come out on the stage and introduce me, and then I would come out with the puppets and doing whatever the puppets would do. And one day this lady came backstage and she said, who's doing the puppets? And they introduced me, and her name was Dorothy Maines. And Dorothy had been director of Children's Fairyland a ways back, and that's where Disney saw her and brought her to Disneyland, and she became director of children's activities at Disneyland. And her sister became director of Children's Fairyland. So anyway, Dorothy Maines said, I think you have the kind of thing we would like at Disneyland. She said, have you thought of coming to Disneyland? Well, who hadn't, you know?
Right.
They've only been open about like 2.5 years or something, you know, or not even 3 years. And so she said, well, when I go back, I'll talk with this friend of mine. He's building a toy store in Fantasyland, and it's called Geppetto's Workshop, the back part of it, which he was interested in having puppets, I think. So then people said, you never hear from her again, you know. Less than a week later, I had a letter from the Emporium of Orange County and Company, and Mrs. Maines had spoken to them, and they would like to talk with me if I have ideas how this could be done. So I called him, and the president of the company got on the phone, and he said, well, could you come down? And I said, yes, I could. So I took the train. I didn't drive at that time.
Yeah.
So I took the train down to I guess it was Anaheim, and got a taxi, I guess, over to Disneyland. Of course, that Disneyland was unbelievable, you know, when you saw it for the first time, you know.
Yeah.
And they liked my work and in what I did. And so they said, well, all right, you know, they said, how would you do this? And they said they were still building the store, and they would have a theater built in the back. And I said, Well, I really didn't work with the theater. I worked on a stage, a platform, and I came out with the puppets, and the puppets came over to the children, and and that's the way I worked, because that's really was influenced by Bob Baker. That's what they did, and so they liked it. They said we could do that. So the architect with Disneyland came over, and we made a rough sketch of how I wanted the stage. They said they could build that, no problem. And so then there came a matter of the costume. They said, well, what would you be dressing like? And I said, well, it's, with the Geppetto setting, it's kind of like a Swiss thing in a way. And I said, I guess I could wear kind of like a Swiss outfit. They said, well, where would you get that? And I said, well, I don't know. And they talked to the wardrobe department there at Disneyland, and they said, well, we can't get involved with making for one person because we have hundreds of people. We have outfits and they have to be washed and cleaned and everything. We can't do with one person. So they suggested I go down to Western Costume, which was next to Paramount Studios. It was a place where they had thousands of costumes. You could have a crowd of people come in and be dressed in colonial clothes. They would have it, And so they sent me down there, and it was looking for a Swiss look, So they went and looked through their stuff, and they came up with, they had one shirt with some embroidery on it, kind of full sleeves, and it had Donald O'Connor's name written on the inside of it, and had a stain on it. So they said that's the only thing that they had. And how much was it? Well, the rent, can you believe this, for that shirt was going to be, it was either $125 or $150 a week.
Oh my gosh.
For the shirt.
Yeah.
So when I went back to Disneyland, Mr. Phillips, who was the president of the company, who was pretty tight with a buck, he just said, what? He said $125 and $50 for a shirt and to rent it? And they said, no, we can't do this. And I was thinking, oh boy, I'm going to lose this job because of this. And so I said, well, I used to design costumes for my puppets. I could design a costume for myself and we could have it made. You think you could do that? Yeah, well, that'll be good. You could do that. We'll see. So I made a drawing, and the guy from the wardrobe came over and looked at it and said, that's good. So I came out with a pair of salt and pepper corduroy pants. I didn't want to have bare legs. And then I had, you saw me in pictures. I made a vest with piping that was kind of Swiss-like, and made a Tyrolean suspenders out of a darker green velveteen. They sewed it out, found somebody to do it, and I bought the fabrics, and that worked fine. They liked it,
Yeah.
And in those days, everything had to be approved by the studio. The little sketch I made, the costumes had to go to the studio. It couldn't be approved just at Disneyland. It had to be by the studio. So that's how I started with that. And I wore that outfit. I eventually the shirt was a wash and wear white shirt, which wash and wear in those days wasn't what it became later. You had to iron them. They didn't look very good.
Yeah.
So I had one shirt. So I went and I bought another shirt. So I had two shirts. So I was always washing a shirt and ironing it. My mom had taught me how to iron. So that's how I went I think the entire time I was there, I wore those same two shirts. And I wore that one pair of corduroy salt and pepper pants.
And the suspenders.
And the suspenders and all that, well, the company that I work for, they were not interested in spending any money. First of all, he asked me what kind of a salary I would expect. And well, I'd already found out maybe through Bob Baker or somebody, I don't know, that they were unionized, and I never belonged to a union before. So I called the union, and they said it was American Guild of Artists, AGVA. And they said, yes, we do have the contract for the park. And I said, is there a scale that you have to? And they said, yes, it's $125 a week for a 6-day week. Oh, now that was a lot of money at that time, 1953, And so I went back and told whatever his name was, the president of the company, and he just sort of almost blew up. He said, a young guy this age wants $125 a week. That's probably more than he was paying his manager, And those girls on the floor that sold probably made 75 cents an hour if they were up a ways, It was that kind of thing. So, well, he didn't have any choice. He called the entertainment department. They said, yes, that's what we have to pay. Everybody here in the park gets that same salary. The Indian dancers, the Mexican couple, and everybody gets that same. And I don't know about the Golden Horseshoe Review. They might have gotten a little bit more. I don't know, because Wally Bogue was kind of a known comedian who was in it. And so anyway, that's how it went. And I never got I got a $10 a week raise at near the end of my tenure there. And one time Disney people said they had this area over that didn't have anything built on it, and they called it Holidayland. And they had a big red and white striped circus tent on it, big full-size circus tent with a stage inside. And they used to do shows in there. And what they would do is they would have these things where the people would have industry parties. And after a certain hour in the day, like maybe 6 o'clock, they could bring all of their employees in, and they had all the rides and everything, no tickets, nothing, all ride, and that was an industry party. And they would have all the entertainers in the park go over this big tent and perform, whatever. And they asked me if I would do that, and I said, yeah, sure, that'd be great. And they said they would pay me $50 for, it was just one time, So I did that, and so I had to get approval with the Emporium, the company I work for. The Emporium of Orange County actually was who I worked for, not Disney itself. Most everybody, I think, also worked for their companies that had names on the thing. So the company, he said, how much are they paying you for this? Because I had to take off in the middle of the day, but I made sure I did it between my shows. So I didn't interrupt the schedule of the shows, because there was a sign in the front that said Bob Mills Puppet Show in every hour. And, he said, I think you should split with us. And the manager of the company listened to that, and he spun around in his chair. I thought, I can't believe he's asking him for that. He collected a check for me for $75 or whatever it was. No, $25. Mm-hmm. But I did it, Well, when they asked me to do it again, and they paid, I think it was more than $50 they were paying, and he didn't ask for it again. But I think he did it to say, you understand, you're working for us, not them. We make the schedule, they don't. But he did collect that money. Yeah. So anyway, that was how my Disneyland things went. But I loved Disneyland. I loved American Indians, and they had that Indian village with real Indians, and I got to know a lot of them, and I'd go over there and watch them dance all the time in between. And it was just, and see all these new things being built,
I wanted to ask about Fairyland, because we kind of went to Disneyland. How long were you at Fairyland?
Just 1 year.
Just 1 year, and then you got poached, so to speak.
That's where the Disney people saw me and plucked me out.
Yeah, and did you do a couple different shows there, and were you in charge of creating those shows, or did...
No, I had to create the show. I was building new puppets all the time and having different puppets do different things. Yeah, that I was doing.
And what are some of the shows that you did, if you can remember, at Fairyland?
Well, it was all variety. Thing, I had a skeleton that fell apart and came together again, and I had clowns, and I had some dancers, and stuff, stock stuff for puppets. I had a wire walker, and trapeze artist, all that stuff. And always got transferred to Disneyland.
Yeah, and was there any from Dorothy or anyone else? Was there like, no, you can't leave and go to Disneyland, or they were like, go,
No, I think Disneyland was such an enormous thing. For me to be asked to do that, they wouldn't have asked that probably. Yeah. And she knew Dorothy Maines anyway, because Dorothy Maines had been director of the park, and Dorothy had been there quite a while with her husband. That's how that went. I was 1 year, and I was gone.
And then, and obviously you moved down to Southern California, right?
Well, I had to get an apartment.
Yeah.
Because up to that time, I'd actually lived with my family.
Right.
And my mom didn't like the idea that I had to leave the family and go down there, and I had to get a little apartment. Little was right, and with a pull-down bed. But it was close enough to Disneyland, and they had to teach me how to drive. I didn't really know how to drive. and my dad bought me a panel truck, an old panel truck that they said it had belonged to a dry cleaners or something, and but Bob Baker had a panel truck, so I thought that was the right thing to have to put my puppets. I could take them around, but I never thought of the fact if I was at Disneyland, I wouldn't be going. I didn't know that I wouldn't be going other places to do shows. I never did.
Yeah.
So that's how it went,
Well, I'm myself. As we spoke before we started talking, that I worked at Disneyland, and I love Disneyland, and it's just amazing to think that they were asking you how to build something in Disneyland for you. You know what I mean? Like that's just like a really. I think that's really cool. Like, hey, you're going to perform here. What do you want? And then you got to say.
Well, yeah, and I made a little sketch of how I worked, and so that was easy for him to translate that. They were building still the toy store.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. Up in the storeroom upstairs, there was a pile of trash in the corner with wood chips and stuff like this. And I was looking in there, and it was a piece of the characters from Peter Pan. They were going to carve these heads. They did. And they were over the doorway when you came into the toy store. As far as I know, they're still there. And they're big heads carved out of wood.
Yeah.
And so I saw it, and I thought, gee, that's going to be thrown away. So I just saved it. And it's got the name of the year it is and the project name, guy's name on it and everything is all what was on this thing. And I also found, when I was there, some drawings that were made by some animators. I think Disney brought some animators out once in a while who would make drawings. And I got a couple of Donald Duck and a Minnie Mouse and different things like this. And I kept those. Years later, I sold them for quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
I had the blueprint mounted, and it was some guy from the animation place because it was getting fragile, and that paper that they're made with, are not meant to be lasting forever.
Right.
And he said I would have this mounted on canvas if you want to keep it. So I did, and then I had it framed and everything. It looked great, and it went for over $1,000.
Wow.
In the auction.
Yeah.
Which wasn't bad since I paid nothing for it.
Right.
But I did have to pay for the framing and that,
Yeah.
And the same with the drawings of Donald Duck and that. I got them for nothing, and they sold for quite a bit too.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was the name of the game. The important thing that you did not ask. When I was a young guy living in Los Angeles, where did I live? I lived between Pico and Venice on Toberman Street, and my address was 1403 Toberman Street. That's important,
Well, all right. Well, we'll put that in the interview. Wait, were you driving every day down to Disneyland?
Yes, when I had to learn how to drive.
Yeah.
But there wasn't much traffic, it seemed like. And I learned to drive at least from the apartment over to Disneyland.
Yeah, because thinking about it now, it's like that would take you an hour to do, or at least.
No. There was nothing in between on Catella or whatever that street was.
Right.
It was nothing but orange groves.
Right.
That was so beautiful at night, especially like the smell of the orange flowers, on the trees was so beautiful. And the whole length, there was nothing else but.
Yeah.
And of course, eventually they tore them all out of there. But don't forget 1403 Toberman Street.
I will not forget it.
That's where I worked my puppets for the first time.
Did you ever get to meet Walt while you were working there?
Not really. I was told when I went to work there, you don't go up and talk to Walt. You don't ask him to sign anything. And if he talks to you, you can talk, but don't ask him questions or, that's a no-no. Mm-hmm. So I know he saw my show 3 times because I spotted him in the background watching. And as soon as people realized he was there, he would scoot out the back door. At the very back door of the Geppetto's workshop, there was a door, went out in the trash bins. And he'd go out there. And so he could have been there some other times and I wouldn't have known. But he saw everything. In those early years, he watched everything. If the wall wasn't the right color, they took it down and redid it. Everything was like that. But I saw them building the toy soldiers for the parade, all of that. So I used to go over there, that big shop. They had a big shop there at that time. And they didn't have, with all the movie things they were doing, they couldn't make all that stuff at the studio, so they actually manufactured a lot of it. And the floats and everything were right there at Disneyland and in the back. So I was always, I mean, I loved all that, to go watch these guys work. And I remember there was one guy, his whole job was to make apples. He had a plaster mold that he'd made, and he'd make these apples out of whatever the material was, and cast these things up, because in the Snow White ride, the witch has a witch in her hand, and she would go, "Have an apple, baby," or whatever she says, and the teenagers would grab the apple off and tear it off. Not every time, but enough times that it kept him busy making these apples all the time. That was his big job.
Yeah.
And but I saw all kinds of things, and I said I got to know the Indians and got to know the sound of their songs and everything, And then I started collecting Indian material, antique things, and I found that there was a lot of that available around that area, around Knott's Berry Farm and all that. So I started collecting that. I still have a few things, but I sold most all of it. I sold, and I had a big collection of animation art too that I collected. And I sold that as well, because my wife and I wanted to go on these big trips to Africa and China, and they're very expensive. And so to get extra money, I sold the animation collection and the American Indian collection. And I remember I sold the Indian collection to a dealer from Santa Fe, and I think it was something like $180,000.
Wow.
For the stuff that he bought. And that was with a 30% discount for him. He was his deal. You would, whatever you said you wanted for it, he said okay, but then he would take 30% of that for his cut. And but anyway, the animation material went to the animation guy that was here in Sherman Oaks. He opened a new gallery. If you've been there, it's beautiful.
Yeah, the Van Eaton Gallery.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
But he had a much smaller space up here. But he bought almost all those cells and background things I had collected, and I had quite a lot of stuff. I didn't sell puppets. That I didn't do until later when I went to work at MGM in makeup, and I'd quit Disneyland. I didn't know what to do. I kept paying for I had a little space. It used to form a laundry room at the whole apartment house I lived in. And I was able to rent that for very nominal sum for that empty space, and I put my workshop in there. And one day I went out there to pay the rent on it. And the lady who was the manager said, "Oh my God, Mr. whatever his name is, he's looking for you. He wants you to get out of there immediately by Sunday." And I thought, oh, wow, what am I going to do? I'm working, all the time at the studio. So I thought, Bob has a lot of guys who work for him. Wonder if they would possibly come over and pick all my stuff up. And, so I called them. They said, "Oh, yeah, they'll do it for me." So they came over with these guys, and they overnight. I mean, it wasn't overnight, but they were there until about midnight on Sunday. And then Bob had all my puppets in. And every once in a while, Alton would call me and say, "You know who Alton was?"
Yeah.
And Alton would call and say, "We'd like to buy the puppets from you. We can use them if you're not going to continue with puppets." And I said, "Well, I don't think I am, but I'm kind of attached to them. I didn't really want to sell them." But he called me about 3 times, and finally he said, "Well, if you're not going to sell us the puppets, I'm going to have to charge you storage for them." And so I said, "Oh, really?" And he had a very high price, I thought, for storing my puppets. So he said, "Well, we could buy them for $1,500 if you would want to sell them to us." So I said, I could see I was going to be at the studios. I wasn't going to be doing puppets. I said, "Okay." And so I got $1,500 for all my puppets. People can't believe that it happened. But anyway, that was it. That's how Bob got all those puppets. Then they've recostumed a lot of them and made them different. And some of them they couldn't use. And like the 2 original puppets that I got, that were his Bob Baker's, they had those still.
Yeah.
And those went to a collector. And I had animated the eyes on them. But anyways, other than that, they were exactly the way they were, costume and everything, the way that Bob sold them.
Well, and I think you mentioned earlier that every once in a while you see them kind of pop up on Bob Baker posters or things like that.
Well, yeah, if you go to their shows, there's a dog clown that comes out and introduces the show. I showed you the picture of one of the dogs.
Yeah.
That dog was made into that character.
Clown, yeah.
And they recostumed it, of course, different. But he was a cowboy like when I made him. And I had some other dogs too. I made it like about 3 different dogs, look something like that. I think I was going to use them together to do something. I don't know what, which I didn't do. And but they made good use of them.
I don't know. I think it's kind of neat that those puppets are still living on and still entertaining.
Yeah, I love that. The fact that they're and the collector has some of them. I think Ray's he's come over, or Steve. I mean, he's come over twice with some puppets that he's got that were mine.
But it's I don't know. It's great to think that these puppets were entertaining how many kids at Disneyland and now still living on. Entertaining kids over at Bob Baker. So it's pretty.
Well, no, I didn't know anything about the 2 candy lollipops being in the poster. Mm-hmm. I just saw the poster in the shop, and I thought, wow, the design of it and everything is great. I'd like to have one. And they said, well, they didn't sell them. And so they gave me one as a gift. And I unrolled it, looked, I thought, oh my gosh, that's my 2 lollipops. And then Alex says, do you know Alex?
Yep. We interviewed him a couple episodes ago.
Okay, well, he said, we've got numbers of pictures of people love those pictures of those lollipops. Yeah. So anyway, that was.
Well, let's talk about you. You did sell all your puppets, and you mentioned being over the studio because you kind of stepped away from puppetry and got into makeup. So, and I think you alluded to that before. I stopped you to ask you more about Disneyland, but how did you get into makeup?
I just finished my last show at 8:00 at night, and they were filming a big something television at Magic Mountain, which was new, the Magic Mountain. So I went over there to watch what they were doing, because although I'd worked in TV in Hawaii, I never had seen the huge equipment like they had with arc lights and cranes and all that stuff that they had brought in to do these shots. And they were doing the ballet dancer Jacques Dembois, was well known, and he was dancing on the mountain or around the mountain or whatever. And I was watching this, and there was 2 guys watching, and they said, "Do you work here?" And I said, "I do." And they said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, well, I have a puppet show here." And they said, "Oh." And he said, one of the guys said, "Do you make your own puppets?" And I said, "I do." And he said, "Oh, you'd be a good makeup artist." They were makeup artists. And I said, yeah, I didn't really think about makeup at that point. So then I got to thinking, I said, I used to like to do makeup in high school, and I did some at college and drama classes. And yeah, maybe I would like to do that. So I thought, well, I guess you have to learn it some way. So I went to a bookstore, and they had one book on motion picture makeup. And so I bought the book. It was just a small book, but it was very informative. So I thought, well, I guess you have to go someplace and learn this. So I looked in the yellow pages of the LA telephone directory, and there was one makeup school listed in there at the House of Westmore. Well, the name Westmore was famous in the business, and you couldn't hardly see a movie that the makeup was always listed makeup Bud Westmore or Wally Westmore or whatever. It was always a Westmore. See, so I figured there must be like 5 makeup artists in Hollywood or something. So anyway, I called them, and they said, yeah, they had. The school, and it said it was 6 months in length, the school, full time. So I said, well, I couldn't go right then because I had to be with the Disneyland, and when we went into the winter months, I could go on weekends. And so I did, although I normally was working all the way through, but, I knew I could do it on weekends. So I made arrangements that I would come in there in February sometime and start the school. When the time came, I called them, and they said, well, the school is closed. And I said, well, I was going to be a student there. And they said, well, we don't know. It was closed, and we don't know if it's going to reopen or anything about it. And it was a salon, big salon attached to it also, that did women's hair and stuff, The makeup school was upstairs. And so I was telling Don Nova's a friend of mine who sang in the Golden Horseshoe Revue. Don was a tenor and he had been a minor star at Warner Brothers when they used to do a lot of musicals. And I was telling him, and he said, "Is that Perce Westmore?" And I said, "Gee, I don't know." He said, "I'll bet it's Perce." He said, "We're friends." He said, "We and I were married to the same woman, but at different times." Right. And he said, "I'll call him at home and see what the deal is." So he called Perce, and Perce said, well, he'd had a little heart attack, and so he closed the school. He said, "I don't know if I'll reopen it or not." He said, "I never took many students." And Don was telling him about me. And he said, "Well, have him come down to the house of Westmore certainly, and I'll talk with him." So I did. I went down, and Perce looked just exactly what I thought this famous makeup artist would look like, in a beautiful silk suit with a silk tie, and everything looking just spiffy as could be. And we talked, and he looked at pictures of my work and drawings I'd made and so forth. And he said, "Well," he said, "I think you'd make a good makeup artist." But he said, "The best way to be trained," he said, "is through the apprenticeship system." But he said, "It's very hard to get one," because he said each studio usually has one, and it's a 3-year training program. So it's very hard to get them. But he said, "I understand that William Tuttle at MGM is going to be taking a new apprentice. Would you like me to call him for you?" And I said, "Yeah." Now, I'd never even been in a studio before at that point. I didn't. The only time I was in the Disney studios once for a tour of their animation department. That's the only time I'd ever been in a studio. So anyway, he called Bill Tuttle, and Bill was head of the department at Metro. Said, well, Perce was telling him about it, and he said, well, send him out that same day, and I'll talk with him. So I went out over to MGM and talked with Bill Tuttle, and he looked at my things I'd done and my puppets and drawings and things, and he said, you obviously have the ability. But he said, I have about quite a few more people to talk with. He said, I can't make a decision until I talk with everybody that's interested. But I'll let you know if. So they took my telephone number, And so I went back to work at Disneyland. And 3 or 4 weeks went by, and I didn't hear anything. So I just picked up the phone. I didn't know anything about the studios or anything, and I just called Bill Tuttle. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Tuttle, I have to know if I'm going to be leaving Disneyland or not, and if you're going to have me work as an apprentice with your department." And Bill said, "Well, I have made a decision." He said, "And you are going to be the next apprentice, and you start 6 o'clock Monday morning."
Gee, thanks for letting me know.
Yeah. So that's what it was.
Yeah.
And that's a makeup artist's time. That's at 6 in the morning, 6 to 8, especially if you have a woman. You think, what star is going to come in at 6 in the morning? They all do. They come in, and they have to be ready, camera ready at 8 o'clock. And the men can come a little bit later because they get faster makeup and, So that was my first thing I started. They gave me a white shop coat to put on, and I stood behind the counter in the stock department. And all these makeup artists and hairstylists would come through and ask for whatever they needed. If it was hairstylists, it might be some kind of hairpins or hairspray or something, and the men would want different makeup and powders. And when people would go by, and they'd say to me, "Are you Bill's son?" And I said, "No." "Are you Bill's brother?" "No." Then they say, "Are you Charlie's son?" Charlie was the lab man, assistant department head. And I said, "No, I hardly knew Charlie." And then they said, "Well, is Keister your father?" "No." They keep asking me these. I don't look like any of those people, I'm sure. I didn't know that nepotism was the rule in makeup to get into it. If you weren't related to somebody, you weren't going to get in.
Yeah.
And almost everybody had somebody, their father, brother, whatever, uncle, or somebody influential in the studio, because those apprenticeships were very, very hard to come by. And I just walked in there and got one. So I didn't find out till later why they kept asking me those questions.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was the start of my apprenticeship. And I worked in the lab, and with Charlie every day, and I learned a lot with lab work from him, although I never really wanted to do lab work because I was making sculpting, making plaster molds. Had been doing that with puppets all along, so it wasn't anything new exactly to me in the way, the techniques. And but applying it and making foam latex appliances was all new. And I learned that. And then finally, I learned ultimately the guys who were in most demand in makeup were those who were very skilled with making up women. Because it was the studio, it were these glamorous stars. That's what the studio was interested in. They didn't care about rubber noses or beards or anything like that. You know, they wanted those women to look for the people to come in to see Doris Day or whoever, you know. So I really paid attention to that, how Charlie Schramm was very good with any makeup, but particularly with women. The women, they always wanted Charlie to do their makeup, you know. So I learned that, and I learned all of it and did well. I had eventually, at the end of your apprenticeship, you have progressive exams every year, which there's certain things you do. By the end, you have to do it all. And by the end, I did, and I got the highest score of the other. There were 3 or 4 of us taking the test at that time, and so I learned well. And then I was put out on a television show called Please Don't Eat the Daisies. And that, I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it was a family show. And they felt that was easy to do, you know, all straight makeups pretty much. They had the main actress, of course, they were making sure that she looked good, Pat Crowley. But it had kids to do, and, you know, and the man who played the father in it, he was supposed to be a college professor. He just died recently at 90 years old. I never realized he was that old. Didn't look at it all. But, well, he wasn't 90 old then, but
Right.
that was how I started.
As we wrap up the interview, this has been so great learning about your incredible career and even transition to makeup and all that stuff. But I always like to ask, what has been the highlight of your puppetry career?
Well, I would have to say being at Disneyland was by far. I mean, I never went beyond that. I just cut it off at that point. You know, it's just all I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, to be in that atmosphere and everything, you know, and seeing Walt all the time and things, it was pretty exciting. It really was.
Yeah. Well, Bob Mills, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the interview.
Many thanks to Bob Mills for being on the show. For links to some of the things we discussed, check out the show notes for this episode number 97, over at underthepuppet.com. And if you'd like to hear even more of my talk with Bob Mills, download the free Under the Puppet app for iOS and Android and click on the gift icon in the listing for this episode. Special thanks to Randal Metz for his help securing this interview. I'd also like to send out a special thank you to all the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who help make this show possible. Patreon patrons at the producer level and above who get a special shout out are Eve Cunning, Kathy Crawford, Tony Urbano, Brandy, David Akers, Paul, Scott Armstrong, Vicky Sebring, Ricky Chavez, and Karina. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media. And thank you for your support. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Under the Puppet. If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback about the show, send them via email to underthepuppet@gmail.com. Or you can connect with the show on Instagram or Facebook by searching for Under the Puppet. And don't forget to tell a friend about the show. This episode featured music by Dan Ring and was incredibly expertly edited by Steven Staver. Thank you so much for listening. Under the Puppet is copyright 2024 Saturday Morning Media Grant Bachoco, executive producer, all rights reserved. www.saturdaymorningmedia.com. Under the Puppet proudly presents The Adventures of Timmy the Tooth Reunion. In this almost 90-minute video, you will hear great stories from the cast and crew who brought this amazing puppet show to life. Plus, you'll see never-before-seen artwork and exclusive behind-the-scenes video. Under the Puppet's Timmy the Tooth Reunion is available right now at timmy.underthepuppet.com. You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.